Cora Whitfield had been a nurse for 38 years. She had held the hands of dying strangers. She had delivered news that broke families in half. She had stood in hospital corridors at 3 in the morning and made decisions that could not be unmade, and she had never once let her hands shake where anyone could see them. They were shaking now. She stood at the front gate of the Whitfield property on a Tuesday afternoon in November, 4 hours after she had watched her husband of 43 years lowered into the ground, and she put her key into the lock and turned it, and nothing happened. The door opened anyway. Theodore was standing on the other side of it. He was wearing a collared shirt, no tie, the look of a man who had dressed for something businesslike, rather than a day of mourning. He looked at his mother on the front step and said her name the way you say the name of someone you are no longer particularly glad to see. "I think you should find somewhere else to stay, Mom. This property belongs to Miranda and me now." Cora looked at her son. She had bought this land in 1974, before she married James, before she had Theodore, before any of the life that followed. She had saved for 6 years on a nurse's salary, and she had paid cash, and she had signed the deed with her own hand, and the deed had carried her name and only her name for 50 years. Miranda appeared from the hallway behind him holding a folder. "We filed a modification with the county recorder's office," she said. Her voice had the practiced smoothness of someone who had rehearsed this moment and was pleased with how it was going. "The court approved the amendment. You are no longer listed as owner of record." Cora did not speak. She turned and walked back down the stone steps, her handbag held against her side, her spine straight, her face giving away nothing that she was not prepared to give. She had learned that in 38 years of nursing. You do not let the room see everything you are feeling. You save that for later when you are alone, when it will not be used against you. But inside, beneath the stillness, a memory was rising. James in the library on an autumn evening in 1998, his hand over hers, his voice quiet in the way it only got when he was saying something he needed her to actually keep. "If anything ever happens, Cora, remember the portrait in the library. Behind it is something no one can take from you." She had thought of it as the kind of thing a husband says. Careful, loving, perhaps slightly dramatic. She understood now that James had not been dramatic. He had been a surgeon. He had always known exactly where the wound would be before it opened. The widow's deed. The stone steps of the Whitfield property were the same steps Cora had climbed 10,000 times. She knew every one of them. The third step had a small chip on the left corner from the winter of 1987, when James had dropped a bag of rock salt and never gotten around to having it repaired. The sixth step caught water when it rained and froze black in January, and she had always reminded everyone in the house to be careful of it. She had climbed these steps as a young woman with groceries, and as a middle-aged woman with medical bags, and as an old woman returning from shifts that had lasted longer than any shift should last, and she had never once needed to be told she was allowed through the door at the top of them. The key did not turn. She had noticed it immediately, the way a nurse notices when something that should respond does not respond, that specific wrongness of a mechanism that has been changed. She had stood for a moment with her hand on the key and understood before the door opened what she was about to face. Theodore had been waiting. He looked like James around the eyes, which had always been both a comfort and a complication, and he was dressed in the careful way of a man who had prepared himself for a confrontation he had been rehearsing. He was 47 years old. Cora remembered the exact weight of him on the morning he was born, 7 pounds and 4 ounces, and the way he had curled his fingers around her index finger without being asked. She remembered that now, standing on the step below him, looking up at her son's face. "I think it would be better for everyone if you found somewhere else to stay," Theodore said. "Miranda and I are the owners of record now. We have the documentation." Behind him, Miranda came into view from the hallway. She was holding a folder the way people hold folders when they want the folder to do some of the work for them, as a prop, as a signal of authority. She had been a bank loan officer before she stopped working, and she carried herself with the institutional confidence of someone accustomed to delivering decisions that other people could not appeal. "We filed an amendment to the property deed 6 weeks ago," Miranda said. "The county recorder accepted the modification. Your name has been removed from the title." Cora looked at the folder. She did not reach for it. In 38 years of nursing, she had delivered information that destroyed people. She had told mothers and husbands and grown children things that changed every moment that came after. She had learned to recognize the specific quality of shock that comes not from the unexpected but from the unthinkable, the kind of news so outside the understood order of things that the mind requires several seconds simply to accept that the words are real. She was experiencing that now, not about the house but about her son, the house she could think about later. The house was a legal matter, and legal matters had solutions. What she could not immediately process was the fact of Theodore standing in the doorway of the home where she had raised him, speaking to her in that particular voice, the voice of a transaction being completed, as though 47 years of her love for him was simply a prior arrangement that had now been superseded by updated paperwork. She had sat with him through pneumonia when he was 6 years old. She had driven him to swim practice at 5:30 in the morning for 4 years. She had worked double shifts to pay for his college when the hospital bills from James's practice had run longer than expected one difficult year, and she had never once mentioned it to Theodore because she had not considered it a sacrifice, only a thing you did for your child because your child needed it. He had been watching her face while these thoughts moved through her, and something in his expression told her he had expected a different reaction. He had prepared himself for tears, perhaps, or argument, or the kind of desperate pleading that would have confirmed his stated position that she was no longer capable of managing her own affairs. He had described her that way to Miranda, she was certain, and perhaps to the attorney who had handled the deed. Modification, an elderly woman losing her grasp, a kindness really to step in and take over. What he had not prepared for was this. Cora looked at her son for a long moment. She looked at him the way she had learned to look at difficult situations in the hospital, with full attention without flinching, cataloging what was actually present, rather than what she had expected to find. Then she picked up her handbag, which she had set on the step beside her, and she turned and walked back down toward the driveway. She heard Miranda say something to Theodore behind her, too quiet to make out. She heard Theodore clear his throat. "Mom," he said, "this is the right thing. You'll understand that eventually." Cora reached the bottom of the steps. The November air was cold and smelled of wet leaves and wood smoke, the particular smell of Connecticut in the fall that she had breathed for 50 years on this property. The oak trees along the drive had gone gold, and the light was low and gray, and the whole landscape looked the way it always did at this time of year, unchanged, indifferent, enduring. She stopped at the end of the path and turned back once. Theodore was still standing in the doorway watching her with the expression of a man who was waiting to feel more certain than he currently did. Cora looked at him steadily. "I'll be back, Theodore," she said. Her voice was even and unhurried, the voice she had used at bedsides for 38 years, the voice that meant she had assessed the situation and knew exactly what came next. "And when I am, I hope you're ready." She turned and walked to her car. She did not look back again. She sat in the driver's seat for a moment with her hands on the wheel and the engine off, and she looked through the windshield at the oak trees she had watched grow from saplings, and she thought about James in the library in 1998, and the portrait, and what he had said about it. She started the engine. She had a phone call to make. The motel was called the Birchwood Inn, and it was 12 miles from the Whitfield property, which was close enough that Cora could have driven past the gate in 20 minutes if she had wanted to, and far enough that she did not have to see the oak trees from the window. She had chosen it for that reason. The room was clean and plain and smelled of the specific neutrality of a place that hosted many people briefly, and remembered none of them. A double bed with a white coverlet, a small table by the window, a bathroom with adequate lighting. Cora had spent enough nights in on-call rooms over the course of her career to feel no particular distress about modest accommodations. She unpacked her one bag with the efficiency of someone accustomed to making temporary spaces functional, set her toiletries on the bathroom shelf in their usual order, and hung her 2 spare blouses in the narrow closet. Then she sat down at the table by the window and looked at the rain. It had started on the drive over the kind of cold November rain that does not intend to stop before dark. The parking lot outside the window was empty except for 2 cars and a truck, and the light was going fast, and the whole scene had the particular desolation of a weekday evening in a place that exists primarily to shelter people in transition. Cora had been in transition before. She knew how to sit with it. She had bought the Whitfield property in the spring of 1974 when she was 28 years old and had just completed her third year as a staff nurse in the emergency department at Hartford General. Her father had died the previous autumn and had left her a modest inheritance, the proceeds from the sale of the hardware store he had operated for 30 years. Her mother had died when Cora was 19, and her father had never remarried, and the store had been his whole life, and leaving it to her had been his way of saying she was his whole life, too. She had not spent the money immediately. She had added to it carefully for 2 years, working extra shifts, living simply the way she had always lived. She had known from the time she was a girl that the only security worth having was the kind you built yourself, because the other kind could be taken. The property had been listed for 4 months when she found it. 11 acres in northeastern Connecticut, a federal-style house built in 1921, a barn that needed work oak trees, planted along the drive by whoever had first owned the land and had the patience to think in decades. She had driven out on a Saturday morning in April and stood in the middle of the front field and felt something she could not name precisely, but recognized as certainty. She had paid cash and signed the deed on a Wednesday afternoon in June. The deed listed one owner, Cora Jean Whitfield. No one else. She had met James 4 months later at a hospital fundraising dinner she had almost not attended because she was tired from a long week and had no particular interest in fundraising dinners. He was a surgical resident newly arrived from Boston, quiet, in the particular way of people who are paying close attention to everything. He had found her in the corner where she had positioned herself near the exit and had asked her about the patient population at Hartford General with the genuine curiosity of someone who actually wanted to know. And she had answered honestly rather than politely, and they had talked for 2 hours and missed the dinner entirely. James had been careful with the property from the beginning. He had understood without being told that it was hers, that she had built it before him, and that this was not incidental but essential. When they married in 1976 and he moved in, he had suggested updating the deed, and she had said she preferred to leave it as it was, and he had said of course and had never raised it again. He used to say, in the easy way, he said things he meant completely, that the house was hers and he was a very fortunate guest. Theodore had been born in 1977. She had loved him with the specific ferocity of a woman who had not been certain she wanted children and then discovered that certainty was entirely beside the point once the child arrived. She had loved him through colic and ear infections and the difficult year when he was 14 and angry at everything, and the prouder years when he was finding his direction, and the complicated years after that, when direction had turned out to mean something different than she had hoped. The distance had always been there. She could see that now with the clarity that comes from sitting alone in a motel room with nothing to do but be honest with yourself. Theodore had felt the absence of 2 parents who were needed elsewhere, whose work was the kind that did not end at 5 o'clock, who came home sometimes with the weight of other people's suffering still on them. She had tried to compensate. James had tried to compensate. Perhaps they had not tried in the right ways. Or perhaps some distances open regardless of what you do, and the only question is what a person chooses to do with the distance. Theodore had chosen this. She thought about the questions he had asked over the past several years, questions she had answered without registering their pattern. What was the property worth now with land values where they were? Whether she had updated her estate documents since James's illness began. Whether she and James had ever considered consolidating the title. Miranda had been present for several of those conversations, quiet and attentive, asking nothing herself, but Cora could reconstruct now the way Miranda's attention had sharpened at certain answers. Miranda had been a loan officer for 11 years. She understood property records, deed modifications, county recorder procedures. She understood how to find the seam in a legal document and how to widen it. Cora understood that now. Outside the window, the rain came down steadily against the empty parking lot, and the light was almost gone. She sat with her hands folded on the table, and she thought about James in the library on that autumn evening, his hand over hers, his voice careful and quiet. The portrait, behind it. She reached for her phone. Diana Ellsworth picked up on the second ring, which meant she had seen the name and chosen to answer, which meant she already knew something had happened, because word traveled in the way it always traveled in families and legal circles that had known each other for decades. "Cora," Diana said, "I heard about James. I'm so sorry." "Thank you," Cora said. "Diana, I need your help. There is something in that house that Theodore doesn't know about, and I need to get to it before he finds it first." Diana Ellsworth's office was on the second floor of a converted Victorian on Elm Street, the kind of building that had been a private residence for most of its life, and still felt like one with tall windows and creaking floors, and the smell of old paper that serious legal work seems to generate regardless of how modern the filing systems become. Diana had been a real estate attorney for 29 years. She had handled the original deed transfer when Cora purchased the Whitfield property in 1974, which was how they had met, and the professional relationship had become something closer over the decades in the way that relationships do when they are built on trust and tested occasionally by difficulty. She was standing at the window when Cora arrived, and she turned with the expression of a woman who had spent the previous 12 hours preparing herself to say something hard. "Sit down, Cora," she said. Cora sat. Diana opened the folder on her desk. The filing was dated 6 weeks prior, which meant Theodore had initiated the process while James was still alive, while Cora had been at the hospital every day managing her husband's final weeks, while her entire attention had been directed toward the man she was losing. The timing was precise in the way that deliberate cruelty is often precise. The petition claimed that Cora Jean Whitfield, age 71, demonstrated diminished capacity with respect to the management of real property assets, and that in the interest of preserving the estate it was appropriate to transfer administrative control to her son Theodore James Whitfield. It cited 2 incidents Cora did not immediately recognize: a missed appointment with an accountant and a lapsed insurance renewal, both of which had occurred during the month of James's hospitalization, both of which had been resolved without consequence, both of which were being presented as evidence of a woman losing her grip on reality. A judge in the county probate division had signed a temporary approval. Cora read the document twice. She read the part where her son had described her to a court as no longer capable. She read it with the same careful attention she had once given to intake forms and medication charts, looking for the precise contours of what was being claimed, cataloging rather than reacting. "He had an attorney," Diana said. "Someone I don't know brought in from outside the county. The filing was thorough. Whoever prepared it knew what they were doing." Miranda, Cora thought. Miranda had known exactly what she was doing. "The temporary approval gives Theodore current administrative authority over the property," Diana continued. "It is not a final determination. It can be challenged, and there is a specific basis for challenge that would supersede everything he has filed." She turned the folder and pointed to a line near the bottom of the property history page. "Original warranty deed, June 1974. Sole grantee Cora Jean Whitfield." A warranty deed from 1974 naming you as sole owner is the foundational document in this chain of title, Diana said. Every subsequent filing, every modification, every amendment Theodore has submitted is built on top of that foundation. If the original deed is produced and authenticated, his modifications do not hold. The court cannot sustain a transfer of property that was never legally his to transfer. The 1974 deed establishes your ownership categorically and completely. "The deed is in the house," Cora said. "I assumed it must be. Do you know where—" Cora was quiet for a moment. She was seeing the library the way it looked in the evenings when James worked late, the lamp on the bookshelves running floor to ceiling along the east wall, the portrait hanging in the center of the west wall between the 2 tall windows. James had hung it himself the year after they were married. He had spent an entire Saturday afternoon finding exactly the right placement, adjusting it by fractions of an inch until it was level, standing back and looking at it with the serious attention he gave to things he considered worth doing properly. It was a portrait of Cora painted by a local artist in 1973, the year before she bought the property. She was 27 in the portrait, in a blue dress she no longer owned, looking slightly to the left of the canvas, with the expression of someone who does not quite believe they deserve to be painted, and is trying not to show it. James had found the portrait at an estate sale 2 years after they met, and had bought it without telling her, and presented it on a Wednesday evening for no particular reason, which was the kind of thing James did. He had hung it on the west wall, and in 1998 he had told her what was behind it. She had not understood then why he felt the need to tell her. She understood now that he had always understood the need. He had simply been waiting until the right moment to say it clearly. "I know exactly where it is," Cora said. Diana leaned forward slightly. "We can file for immediate legal access. Given the circumstances, I can make a strong argument for an emergency order. But the process will take time, Cora. A week at minimum, possibly 2. The court calendar is not accommodating, and Theodore's attorney will contest." "Theodore is already talking to buyers," Cora said. She had heard it from Martha Greer, a neighbor who had known the family for 30 years and who had called that morning with the particular careful tone of someone delivering information they wished they did not have. A real estate agent had been at the property on Sunday. A couple from out of state had walked the grounds. Diana's expression tightened. "If the property goes under contract before we can establish your claim in court, the situation becomes substantially more complicated. A third-party buyer complicates everything." "Then I cannot wait for the court process," Cora said. "Cora, entering the property without authorization, even your own property, creates legal exposure that could compromise your position." "I am not going to break anything," Cora said. She was looking at the property map on Diana's wall, the one showing the Whitfield parcel, the house footprint, the barn, the tree line along the eastern edge. She was thinking about the library. She was thinking about the window on the south side of the library, the one that faced the side garden, the one with the old latch that had never seated properly because the frame had warped slightly in the summer of 2003, and James had always meant to have it fixed and never had. She had reminded him about that latch many times over 20 years. She was grateful now that he had never gotten around to it. She looked at Diana. "I don't need to use the front door," she said. "The library has a side window. It's never locked properly. It hasn't been for 20 years. Diana looked at her for a long moment with the expression of a lawyer who is calculating several things simultaneously. "I did not hear that," Diana said finally. "No," Cora agreed. "You didn't." She went at 2 in the morning. She had considered earlier, but 2 was the hour she knew from 38 years of night shifts, the deepest point of sleep for most people, the hour when the body overrides the mind, and even the anxious and the guilty go under. Theodore had never been a light sleeper. She remembered that from his childhood, the way he could sleep through thunderstorms and early mornings and every attempt to rouse him for school. Miranda she was less certain about, but 2 in the morning was the best odds she had, and she took them. She parked on the service road that ran along the eastern edge of the property, behind the tree line where the truck belonging to the groundskeeper had always parked, and where the gravel gave way to packed dirt that did not announce the presence of tires. She sat in the car for a moment with the engine off and let her eyes adjust to the dark. The night was cold and clear. The oak trees along the drive were bare now, November having finished what October had started, and the moonlight came through without obstruction and lay across the fields in long, pale shapes. She had walked this property in every season for 50 years, and she knew its sounds, the particular settling of the barn in cold weather, the way the wind moved differently through the east field than the west, the creak of the side gate when it turned on its hinge. She knew the sounds that belonged and the sounds that did not. She crossed the field along the fence line, staying in the shadow of the tree line, where the moonlight did not reach, moving steadily and without hurry. A nurse learns early that rushing creates noise, and noise creates problems. You move with purpose, and you move quietly, and you do not let the urgency you feel translate into the speed of your feet. The house was dark. 2 windows on the second floor, both closed. Theodore and Miranda's room was at the back of the house, the guest room that Cora had repainted twice over the years and had never particularly liked the proportions of. She had always thought it faced the wrong direction. From that room, you could not see the oak drive or the front field, or any of the things that made the property itself. The library window was on the south side, facing the kitchen garden that Cora had planted and replanted over 40 years, the beds now gone to their winter state, cut back and mulched waiting. The window was 4 feet off the ground, a double-hung sash with a wooden frame that had expanded in the summer heat of 2003 and contracted in the following winter and never returned to its original dimension. The latch sat a 1/4 inch shy of its seat. You could see the gap if you looked for it. Cora had looked at it for 20 years. She set her hands on the sill and applied gentle upward pressure to the lower sash, the way you open something that requires persuasion rather than force, and the window rose with a soft resistance, and then gave moving up in the slightly uneven way of old wood that has found its own accommodation with time. She raised it 8 inches. Enough. She went through with the particular care of a woman who has learned not to trust her joints in the cold, taking her time, making no sound she had not already accounted for. The library received her. She stood just inside the window for a moment and let the room settle around her. It smelled of books and wood, and the specific quietness of a space that had not been occupied in weeks, that was holding itself in abeyance. The furniture was where it had always been. The shelves were undisturbed. Someone had left a coffee cup on the side table near the door, a single evidence of Theodore's occupation that Cora noted and set aside. The moonlight through the south window reached the center of the room, but not the west wall. She waited until her eyes had fully adjusted before she moved. The portrait was where it had always been, centered on the west wall between the 2 tall windows hanging on the picture rail James had installed specifically for it. In the dark, she could see the shape of it, the pale oval of the painted face, the frame that James had chosen himself from a framer in Westport dark wood with a narrow gilt edge understated in the way he preferred things. She crossed to it in the dark, placing her feet with the same quiet intention she had used in hospital wards for decades, the walk of someone who has learned that the environment matters and that you owe it your attention. She stood before the portrait and looked at her younger face for a moment. 27 years old, painted in the year before she bought this land, before James, before Theodore, before everything that had followed. The woman in the portrait was looking slightly to the left with an expression that Cora had always thought looked uncertain. James had disagreed. He had always said she looked like someone who knew exactly where she was going and was simply deciding on the pace. She lifted the frame from the picture rail with both hands, the way you lift something you intend to treat carefully, and set it against the baseboard below. The wall behind it was plaster painted the same cream color as the rest of the room. To any eye that had not been told to look, it was simply wall. But approximately 8 inches above center, where the lower edge of the frame had always hung, there was a seam in the plaster that was not a crack. A rectangle, perhaps 10 inches by 8, its edges flush with the surrounding surface, its presence announced only by the faintest continuous line that James had sealed and repainted himself the year he installed it. Cora placed her fingertips along the right edge and pressed. The small door gave inward on a spring hinge. The safe was set into the wall behind it, a residential model no larger than a shoebox. Its dial faced the same gunmetal gray it had been when James had shown it to her in 1998, standing in this room, in the lamplight, his hand over hers. She placed both hands on the dial. The combination was the 14th of March, 1976, the day they were married. She had never written it down anywhere because she had never needed to. She turned the dial with steady hands. Right to 14, left past 0 to 3, right again to 76. The mechanism moved through its sequence with the deliberate precision of something built to last, something installed by a man who had understood that it might need to work correctly after a very long time had passed. The final tumbler sat. The handle turned. The door opened. The safe was not empty. Cora had prepared herself for the possibility that it might be had constructed a version of this moment in which she opened the door and found nothing or found something destroyed because Theodore had found it first, or Miranda had found it, or someone had known and had acted before she could. She had prepared herself for that outcome the way she had learned to prepare for bad outcomes in the hospital, not by expecting them, but by acknowledging that they were possible, so that the shock of them would not undo her. The safe was not empty. At the front, folded once horizontally and placed with its fold at the bottom, the way you place something you want to remain flat and undamaged, was a document on paper, heavier than ordinary paper, the particular weight and texture of legal instruments from an era when such things were prepared to last. She could see in the beam of her small flashlight that the paper had aged to a warm ivory, the color of old documents that have been stored correctly and carefully away from light and moisture. She lifted it with both hands and unfolded it with the care of someone handling something that cannot be replaced. The header read "Warranty Deed" in block letters across the top and below, that the county name and state, and below that the date, June 14, 1974. She read the granting clause. In consideration of the sum paid, the grantor hereby conveys and warrants to the grantee, Cora Jean Whitfield, a single woman, the following described real property. Her name alone. Exactly as it had been written 52 years ago by a county clerk in an office that smelled of cigarette smoke and carbon paper on a Wednesday afternoon when she had been 28 years old and had not yet met James and had not yet imagined the life that would be built on this land. At the bottom below the legal description of the parcel were 2 signatures. The notary's seal was embossed into the paper, still crisp, still legible, the kind of official mark that does not fade, because it is pressed into the material itself rather than printed on top of it. Beside it was her own signature from 1974, the signature of a young woman with her whole life in front of her, slightly more emphatic than her current signature, the way young people sign things with a completeness they gradually learn to moderate. She looked at her own name for a long moment. Behind the deed, held against the back wall of the safe by nothing more than its own placement, was an envelope. Cream-colored, unsealed, with her name written on the front in James's handwriting. Not Cora Whitfield, not Mrs. Whitfield. Simply Cora in the handwriting she had read for 43 years, the slightly forward lean of it, the particular way he formed the capital C with a small upward serif that she had always found characteristic. The envelope was dated in the upper right corner in the same hand. March 2010. 13 years ago. Theodore had been 33. James had been 61 and in good health and had seen something Cora had not yet allowed herself to fully see. She unfolded the letter. It was 2 pages written on the good stationery he kept in the library desk. The heavyweight bond paper he used for correspondence he considered worth keeping. His handwriting was even and unhurried, the handwriting of a man who had composed what he wanted to say before he began writing it. "My dear Cora," it began. "If you are reading this, then something has happened that I hoped would not happen, but planned for anyway, because a surgeon learns early that hoping for the best outcome and preparing for the other one are not contradictory acts. They are simply both necessary. I want you to know that I have watched you carefully for 40 years. I have watched you with patience and with the staff and with Theodore and with me. And I want to say plainly what I have perhaps not always said. Plainly enough, you are the strongest person I have ever known. Not strong in the way people sometimes mean when they say it to women, meaning that you have endured things without complaint. Strong in the way that matters, which is that you have always known what was right and found the means to do it. I am telling you where the deed is because I believe there may come a time when Theodore will make choices I cannot predict or prevent. I have seen something in him that concerns me, not his character at its core, which I believe is better than he currently knows how to access, but his judgment when fear and want are both present. Miranda is capable, which in this context is not an uncomplicated thing. The deed is yours. It has always been yours. Nothing that happens after I am gone can change what was true before I arrived. You bought this land. You built this life. I was fortunate enough to be invited into it, and I have never for a single day forgotten that. Come home, Cora. Whatever they have done or tried to do, come home. The house has been waiting for you since 1974, and it will wait as long as it needs to. All my love, all of it always, James. She stood in the dark library with the letter in her hands, and she allowed herself the thing she had not allowed herself since the funeral. The full weight of his absence, the specific and irreplaceable silence where his presence had been. The tears came quietly, the way Cora did most things, without announcement, without theater. She did not try to stop them. There was no one to hold herself together for in this dark room, and James had always known when she needed to let something go. She stood there for perhaps 2 minutes. Then she folded the letter back into the envelope, placed the envelope against the deed, and pressed both items flat against her chest, beneath her left arm, inside her coat, against her sternum, where she could feel the paper through the fabric. She closed the safe. She pressed the portrait back against the wall. She picked up her flashlight. She turned toward the window. The light came on. It was the overhead fixture, the one James had wired himself in 1989, the one with the slightly warm tone that had always made the library feel like the right place to be in the evening. It flooded the room completely and without warning, and Cora stood still in the center of it, the coat held closed with one hand, and looked at the doorway. Miranda was standing in it. She was wearing a robe, her hair loose, her expression carrying the particular quality of someone who had not been asleep. She was holding her phone in her right-hand screen up, and she looked at Cora with the cold calculation of a woman who had planned for more than one outcome and was now selecting from her options. She looked at Cora's coat, at the hand holding it closed, at the wall where the portrait hung. Then she looked at Cora's face and smiled the way she had smiled on the front step on the day of the funeral, thin and certain and entirely without warmth. "What exactly do you think you're doing, Mother?" she said. "Breaking into a house that doesn't belong to you anymore." Cora did not move. She stood in the center of the library with the overhead light on and Miranda in the doorway, and she did not step back or adjust her coat or change her expression in any way that would tell Miranda what she needed to know. 38 years of nursing had taught her that the first thing you do in an unexpected situation is nothing, that stillness is information, and that the person who moves first often moves wrong. Miranda was watching her coat. She knew, or suspected. The suspicion was visible in the way her eyes kept returning to Cora's left side, to the hand holding the coat closed, to the slight irregularity in the drape of the fabric over something held against the body beneath. Cora reached into her coat pocket with her right hand and found her phone. She had Diana's number set to the first position in her contacts, which she had done 2 days ago in the motel room on Sycamore Street, while the rain came down, because she had known even then that there would be a moment that required fast action, and that her hands might be occupied when that moment came. She pressed the number without looking at the screen. Miranda took a step into the room. The call connected on the second ring. Diana said her name alert and awake, in the way of someone who had also been expecting this call, who had perhaps also been sitting up in a room somewhere waiting for the phone to ring. "Library," Cora said. "Now, please bring someone." She returned the phone to her pocket. Miranda had stopped moving. The calculation behind her eyes was running fast, updating itself against this new information, and Cora could see the moment when Miranda decided that whatever she did next should have a witness and that Theodore should be present for it. She turned her head toward the hallway and called his name once sharply in the tone of someone who expects immediate compliance. Theodore appeared in the doorway in 2 minutes, sleep, rumpled and confused in the way of a man yanked from rest before his mind had fully engaged. He looked at his mother standing in the center of the library, and his expression moved through confusion into something more complicated. He said her name. Cora looked at her son in the overlarge light of the library in the room where James had worked and read and lived for 43 years, in the house she had bought at 28, with the money her father had left her, and she felt the full complicated weight of who Theodore was to her, had always been to her, and she said nothing. Miranda spoke instead, quickly and with precision, laying out what she believed the situation to be. Cora had entered the property without authorization. Cora had gone directly to the library. Something had been taken from the wall. The portrait was not hanging correctly. She had seen it immediately when the light came on. Theodore needed to understand that his mother had come here tonight to remove property that was no longer hers to remove. Theodore listened to his wife. Then he looked at Cora. Something moved across his face that was not quite the expression Miranda had been constructing for him. Cora recognized it because she had seen it before years ago when he was a boy and had been caught in something he had not fully thought through, and was only now beginning to understand the dimensions of. He had never been good at sustaining things that required him not to see clearly, and he could see clearly now, or was beginning to. Miranda could not see it. She was already moving toward Cora. Cora stepped back once, not in retreat, but in positioning, placing the library desk between herself and Miranda, and she said in her clearest and most level voice, the voice she had used when situations in the emergency ward were moving faster than they should, "Do not touch me, Miranda. That would be a serious mistake." Miranda stopped. The front door opened 22 minutes later. Diana Ellsworth came through it with the composed urgency of a woman who had dressed quickly and driven fast, and arrived exactly as prepared as if she had been given a week's notice. Beside her was a county sheriff's deputy named Garrett, a broad-shouldered man in his 40s who Diana had introduced to Cora once at a community meeting, and who clearly knew Diana well enough to have driven out at 2:30 in the morning on her request without extensive explanation. They came into the library and the room rearranged itself around their presence. Deputy Garrett looked at everyone in turn with the professional assessment of someone accustomed to entering rooms where a situation has developed and needs to be understood before it can be resolved. He did not appear alarmed. He appeared attentive. Diana looked at Cora first. Cora opened her coat and showed her the documents held against her chest. Diana looked at them for 3 seconds and then looked at Theodore and Miranda with the expression of a woman who has just confirmed what she suspected and is now prepared to be very precise about it. She spoke to Deputy Garrett first. She explained the property history clearly and without unnecessary detail. The 1974 warranty deed sole grantee Cora Jean Whitfield. The petition Theodore had filed the temporary probate approval, its limited and provisional nature. She explained that the temporary approval did not constitute a final determination of ownership, that no court had issued a final ruling, stripping Cora of her property rights, and that under those circumstances, Cora retained the legal right to access the property and to retrieve items that were legally her personal property. She then turned to Theodore. The original warranty deed from 1974, she said, was executed in Cora's name and constitutes her personal property as the named grantee and sole owner of record. It predates the marriage, predates any joint estate arrangement, and predates every document Theodore had filed by 50 years. Cora had the legal right to have it in her possession. Theodore opened his mouth. Diana continued without pausing. Any attempt to physically take the deed from Cora tonight would constitute interference with personal property and potentially theft, both of which Deputy Garrett was present to note. She suggested Theodore consider that very carefully before he decided how to proceed. Theodore closed his mouth. Miranda had gone the color of old plaster. She was looking at the deed in Cora's hands with the expression of someone watching a structure they built with great care begin to come apart at its load-bearing points, which was exactly what was happening. Cora sat down in James's chair, the leather one beside the desk that had shaped itself over decades to the particular posture of a tall man who read with his legs crossed. She held the deed and the letter in her lap with both hands, not gripping them, simply holding them the way you hold something you have been waiting to hold for a long time. Diana photographed every page of the deed with her phone, methodically each image checked for clarity before she moved to the next. She photographed the notary seal separately close up. She photographed the date stamp at the county recorder's office, the grantee clause, the legal description of the parcel. She sent the images before she put the phone away, and Cora heard the soft completion sound of a message delivered. Theodore was sitting on the arm of the sofa, not looking at anyone. Miranda stood near the window. The room was very quiet except for the occasional sound of Deputy Garrett's radio, low and distant. Diana put her phone in her pocket. She looked at Cora, and then at Theodore, and then at the room in general with the unhurried calm of a woman who had done what she came to do and was now simply closing the matter. "The judge has agreed to an emergency hearing," she said. "Tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. She folded her hands. "I would strongly recommend that both of you have your attorney present," she said to Theodore and Miranda. This is the last piece of advice I will offer without a formal legal proceeding." The clock on the library mantel read 2:57 in the morning. Outside the library windows, the Connecticut night was cold and clear, and the oak trees stood without moving in the still air exactly as they had stood for 50 years, patient and indifferent and entirely unconcerned with the urgency of human arrangements. Cora held the deed in her lap and waited for morning. The county courthouse opened at 8:30. Cora was on the steps at 8 o'clock. She had not slept. After Diana and Deputy Garrett had left the property at 3 in the morning, she had sat in James's chair in the library until the light changed, holding the deed in her lap, listening to the house. Theodore and Miranda had gone back upstairs without speaking to her. She had heard their voices through the ceiling at intervals low and urgent, the sound of two people recalibrating in the dark. She had not tried to hear the words. The words no longer mattered in the way they might have mattered the day before. She had the deed. Diana arrived at the courthouse at 8:15 with the paralegal and 2 accordion files and the specific focused energy of a woman who had slept 4 hours and found them sufficient. She looked at Cora with the assessing eye of someone checking that what she needed to be present was present. "How are you?" Diana said. "Ready," Cora said. They went inside. Theodore and Miranda arrived at 8:50 with an attorney. Cora did not recognize a tall man with silver hair and the expensive suit of someone whose retainer reflected his reputation. He moved through the courthouse hallway with the ease of a man accustomed to winning, speaking in low tones to Theodore, while Miranda walked slightly apart, her face arranged into the careful composure of someone performing a confidence she was working hard to maintain. Theodore looked at his mother once in the hallway. Cora looked back at him steadily and said nothing. The hearing room was the same configuration as every county hearing room Cora had ever seen, which was not many, but enough. Long table raised, bench fluorescent light that made the room feel more procedural than the matters decided in it warranted. Judge Alma Reyes took her seat at 9 o'clock with the unhurried authority of a woman who had presided over a great many proceedings and had learned to distinguish quickly between the ones that were complicated and the ones that only appeared to be. She reviewed the filings for 3 minutes in silence. Theodore's attorney presented first. He was skilled and thorough, and Cora gave him the attention he deserved, which was the attention of a woman who had learned that you should always understand clearly what is being argued against you. He presented the petition Theodore had filed, the temporary probate approval, the transfer of title documentation. He described the situation as a straightforward matter of an aging parent whose capacity to manage significant real property assets had declined, and a son who had acted out of concern and in accordance with proper legal channels. He used the word voluntary 3 times. Cora had voluntarily indicated to her son that she wished him to take over management of the estate. Cora had voluntarily signed documents indicating her intention to transfer administrative control. The modification to the deed of title reflected her own freely expressed wishes. He placed a document on the table in front of the judge. Cora looked at the signature on it from across the room. She had not signed that document. She had never seen it before in her life. Diana rose. She spoke for 11 minutes without notes in the unhurried, deliberate manner of a woman who understood that the quality of an argument is not measured by its speed. She laid the timeline from the beginning. The 1974 warranty deed executed and recorded when Cora Jean Whitfield was 28 years old and unmarried, purchasing the property with her own funds, recorded as sole grantee in the county records where it had remained for 52 years. The deed was not a marital asset. It was not a joint asset. It had never been anything other than Cora's sole and separate property from the day it was recorded to the present moment. She placed the original deed on the table. The room looked at it. Even across the distance, Cora could see the judge lean forward slightly, the instinctive movement of someone who recognizes that what they are looking at is significant. Diana then introduced the forensic document examiner, the same compact, precise man she had located at 6 in the morning and who had examined the transfer document Theodore's attorney had just presented to the court. He took his seat and explained his methodology and his findings in the efficient manner of a professional who respects the court's time. The signature on Theodore's transfer document was not consistent with the known signatures of Cora Jean Whitfield across 5 decades of documented records. The pressure profile was wrong. The letter formation was wrong. The baseline characteristics were wrong. In his professional opinion, the signature had been copied from a source document with limited examples of the subject's handwriting, likely a context where the signature was produced in a relaxed and non-pressured setting. He paused. The source document, he continued, appeared to be a Christmas card. The particular combination of letter characteristics matched the signature style found on informal, seasonal correspondence rather than legal documents where most people's signatures differ in subtle but measurable ways. Someone had taken Cora's signature from a Christmas card and reproduced it on a legal transfer document. The room was very quiet. Theodore's attorney spoke briefly. He questioned the methodology. He raised the possibility of natural variation in an elderly person's handwriting. He was professional and he was competent, and he had nothing to work with, and all 3 of these things were simultaneously visible. Judge Reyes asked Diana one clarifying question about the chain of title, and then asked if there was anything further. Diana said there was one more item. She invited Cora to speak. Cora stood. She was 71 years old and she had been awake for 27 hours, and she stood with her spine straight and her hands at her sides, and she looked at the room, at Diana, at the judge, and then she turned and she looked at her son. Theodore was sitting with his head slightly lowered, his hands on the table in front of him, and when she looked at him, he looked back, and for a moment she could see him clearly, all of him, the boy and the man, and the distance between who he had been and what he had done. She had carried him for 9 months. She had sat beside his bed through the pneumonia when he was 6, and had not slept for 3 days because she was afraid to leave the room. She had worked double shifts at Hartford General so that he could go to the school he wanted, and she had never mentioned it because it had not seemed like something to mention, only something to do. She spoke to the room, but she looked at her son. "I gave birth to this man," she said. "I raised him in that house. I sat up with him when he was sick, and I drove him to practice, and I worked every hour that was asked of me so that he would have what he needed. I loved his father for 43 years, and I did not sign those documents." She paused. "I have never in my life taken what did not belong to me. I built that property before Theodore was born. I have kept it for 50 years, and I did not give it away." She sat down. The room was still. At the other end of the table, Miranda had stopped performing composure. She was looking at her hands, and something in her posture had changed the particular collapse of a structure that has been held under tension for too long. Theodore was not looking at anyone. He had been crying for several minutes in the way of a man trying not to be seen crying, which was the way he had cried as a boy with his face turned slightly away. Cora had seen it many times. It had never before given her this particular feeling. Judge Reyes wrote something on her legal pad. She reviewed the deed one more time slowly, with the reading glasses she had removed and replaced twice during the proceedings. She looked at the forensic examiner's report. She looked at the transfer document with the forged signature. She removed her glasses and looked at the room. She spoke in the measured sentences of a judge who has reached a clear conclusion and sees no reason to make it complicated. The temporary probate approval was vacated. The petition Theodore had filed was dismissed with prejudice. The transfer of title document was declared void on the basis of fraudulent execution. The 1974 warranty deed, naming Cora Jean Whitfield as sole owner of record, was confirmed as the controlling title document. The Whitfield property was and had always been the sole and separate property of Cora Jean Whitfield, and no subsequent filing had the legal standing to alter that fact. The matter was being referred to the county prosecutor's office for investigation into deed fraud and forgery. Theodore and Miranda had 48 hours to vacate the premises. The gavel came down. Cora looked at the deed on the table in front of her, the paper that was 52 years old and had survived everything that had been done to undo it. And she placed her hand flat on the surface of it, the way she had once placed her hand on the wall of that property at 28 years old and felt what certainty felt like. It felt the same. The locksmith Diana had arranged came at 7 in the morning 2 days after the hearing and restored the original lock mechanism to the front door of the Whitfield property. Cora watched him work from the bottom of the stone steps. She had the old key in her hand, the one she had carried on her ring for 50 years, the one that had not turned in the lock on the afternoon of James's funeral, because Theodore had changed everything he could think to change, in the belief that changed locks meant changed facts. The locksmith tested the mechanism twice and nodded to her. She climbed the stone steps. She put the key in the lock and turned it, and the door opened the way it had always opened, with the slight resistance of a well-fitted door in a solid frame, the resistance that means the house is built properly and has not shifted. She went inside. The house was empty in the particular way of a place that has recently been vacated, with the traces of other people's occupation still present in small ways. A coffee ring on the side table in the sitting room. A curtain not quite returned to its proper position. The particular smell of someone else's preferences in a space that had not been aired. Theodore and Miranda had taken what was theirs and left within the 48 hours the court had given them. She did not know where they had gone and had not asked. She went through each room and opened the windows. It took her 20 minutes to open every window on the ground floor, moving through the house methodically, the way she had moved through hospital wards room by room, making each space what it needed to be. The November air came in cold and clean, and the house began to breathe again, the particular slow exhalation of a place returning to itself after an interruption. She saved the library for last. The portrait was still on the wall, not quite level, not quite where James had spent a Saturday afternoon placing it. She straightened it first, standing back twice to check the alignment the way James had done, adjusting by fractions until it was correct. The young woman in the portrait looked back at her from 1973, 27 years old, looking slightly to the left with the expression James had always said was certainty, and Cora had always thought was uncertainty, and which she now understood was probably both at once, which is the true expression of someone standing at the beginning of a life they cannot yet see the shape of. She looked at herself for a long moment. She had been that woman. She was still that woman in every way that mattered, which is to say, in the ways that were chosen rather than given. The deed she had brought from Diana's office that morning, where it had been held for safekeeping since the night in the library. Diana had suggested a bank vault for long-term storage, and Cora had agreed that was sensible, and had also asked Diana to have a copy made and framed, which Diana had done without asking why, because Diana understood why. The framed copy went on the wall of the library to the right of the portrait, where the light from the tall windows fell across it clearly. The heading was readable from across the room. Warranty Deed, June 14th, 1974. The name beneath it smaller but no less legible to anyone who came close enough to look. Cora Jean Whitfield. Theodore's letter arrived on the 4th day. It was longer than she expected, 4 pages in his handwriting, which she had not seen in some years, and which looked more like James's handwriting than she had previously noticed. He wrote about the investigation and the attorney he had retained, and the likelihood which his attorney had apparently made clear to him that the prosecution would proceed, regardless of what Cora chose to do with her own complaint. He wrote about Miranda carefully in the way of a man trying to be honest about something complicated without fully arriving at the honest thing. He wrote about the money troubles she had not known, about the decisions that had seemed reasonable in a certain light, the way fear had made a wrong thing feel necessary. He wrote near the end that he was sorry, that he knew sorry was insufficient, that he did not expect her to do anything with the apology except receive it. He asked her to consider withdrawing her portion of the complaint. Cora read the letter twice, at the desk in the library, in the chair that had been James's in the room where James had worked for 43 years. She read it with the full attention she gave to things that deserved full attention, without deciding in advance what she felt simply reading and letting the words be what they were. Then she took a sheet of the good writing paper from the desk drawer and she wrote back. She told him she would not withdraw the complaint. She told him that what he had done had consequences that belonged to him, and that she was not able to carry them for him, had never been able to carry them for him despite having tried in various ways for 47 years, and that this was the final version of that truth. She told him that she loved him, that she had loved him since the morning he was born, and that this had not changed, and would not change regardless of what happened in the legal proceedings or after them. That love of that particular kind, the love of a mother for a child, was not conditional on deserving, and was not withdrawn by disappointment, and was she had come to understand both the greatest thing she had and the thing that had most consistently caused her pain. She told him that was the nature of it, that she had accepted the nature of it. She sealed the envelope and set it on the table to be mailed, and then she sat for a while in the quiet of the library and looked at the portrait and the deed on the wall and the light coming through the tall windows, and she let herself feel everything she was feeling without organizing it into something more manageable. She felt the loss of him, not the loss of who he had been in the past weeks, but the loss of who she had believed he was, the loss of a version of her son that had perhaps been more her construction than his reality. That loss was its own kind of grief, and it deserved its own time. She also felt the house around her, solid and patient, the same house it had been in 1974, when she had stood in the front field and felt certainty, the same house it had been through 50 years of seasons and changes and the long, quiet life she and James had made inside it. The James Whitfield Scholarship Fund was Diana's suggestion, practically speaking, and Cora had been thinking about it before Diana suggested it, which was how she knew it was right. It was funded from a portion of the estate and directed toward medical students at Hartford General's affiliated program, students who had demonstrated both clinical aptitude and financial need, students who reminded the selection committee of a young woman who had once saved carefully and worked extra shifts and understood that the only security worth having was the kind you built yourself. James would have been quietly pleased and would not have said so directly, which was how she knew he would have been pleased. On the morning the foundation was formally established, Cora went to the library and stood before the portrait. The woman in it looked back at her from across 52 years, with that expression that was both uncertain and certain, both beginning and arriving. Cora placed her hand flat against the painted surface of the canvas, against the image of her own younger face. And she stood there for a moment in the morning light, with the house quiet around her, and the deed on the wall beside her, and the garden visible through the tall windows where the last roses of November were holding on against the cold with the particular stubbornness of things that were planted to last. She thought of James hanging this portrait on a Saturday afternoon, adjusting it by fractions, standing back to look, getting it right. She thought of him in this room in 1998, his hand over hers, telling her what was behind it. She thought of the letter he had written in 2010, 13 years before she found it, with the patience of a man who understood that some things needed to be prepared long before they were needed. She thought of what he had written. "Come home, Cora. The house has been waiting for you since 1974. She looked at the portrait, at her own face from the year before everything began. "Thank you, James," she said quietly to the room, to the man who had loved her carefully and completely, and had known even at the end exactly what she would need. "Our house is still standing." Outside the library windows, the Connecticut morning was clear and cold, and the oak trees along the drive stood in the November light exactly as they had stood for 50 years, patient and enduring, planted by someone who had understood that the best things are built for longer than any one person can see. If you have been with Cora through everything she carried in these weeks, then you know that this story was never only about a deed or a courtroom or even a house. It was about what it means to build a life with your own hands and refuse to let it be taken. It was about a man who loved a woman well enough to protect her from beyond his own lifetime. And it was about a mother who lost her son not to death, but to choices, and who loved him anyway, because that is what mothers do, and because Cora Whitfield had never in her life abandoned something she had built. If this is your first time with Widow's Legacy, there is more here waiting for you. And if you have stayed with us from the beginning, we will see you in the next one.